Welcome to Desktop Prototyping Essentials in Framer. My name is Akram Khalid, and in this video, we'll be learning about previews and sharing. If you are watching this video from YouTube, be sure to click the link in the description below to follow along in Framer. Before we begin, make sure to switch pages in the upper left corner to follow along with the correct part of the tutorial. The preview window displays your project as an interactive prototype, and throughout our video series, we've been relying on it to test and interact with our prototype. In the top left section of our preview window, there is a hamburger menu that we can click on, which opens up additional options. It's split up in frame settings and preview settings, and to get a better understanding, we'll go through each individual option. The first option we'll select is responsive. This option allows us to test out our responsiveness for our design. We can adjust the width and you can see the reflected outcome on our screen where it does shrink the recent transactions so that it is more responsive. If we select the hamburger menu and disable it, you'll see that now the width and the height are kind of set to the aspect ratio and it just decreases in size rather than it being responsive. I'll go ahead and re-enable it for future use. And to get a better understanding of how responsiveness in Framer works, we need to talk about two things: layout constraints and pinning. Each element placed within a frame will always have a position relative to its parent frame. This is also known as layout constraint. By pinning constraints, you can lock them in place and essentially tell Framer that an element should always be positioned a certain way no matter what happens. If we focus on the top right section underneath the layout property, we can see we have position of the top, right, bottom, and left. These are our constraints, meaning that the frame nested within our parent cannot go past these certain constraints or margins. Our pins are what allows us to lock these constraints if the viewport or preview window were to ever change in size. Right now the right and left pins are enabled, meaning if we are to resize our preview window, both the right and left constraints will not change. If I were to go ahead and disable the right and left pins and preview, we can see that as I resize the preview window, the recent transaction is no longer responsive. Closing the preview window and selecting recent transactions, I'll enable the right and left pins again. If we preview as I start adjusting the preview window, you can see it is responsive again. One thing I do want to note is we don't always need to use the preview window to view responsiveness. We can select the frame itself and adjust the width. I do also want to talk about if we were to adjust the height. Right now, we don't have any pins set to the bottom. So as I am adjusting the height, you can see that it is starting to cover up the recent transactions. If I wanted to fix that, I can select recent transactions and add a pin to the bottom. And as I adjust the height, you can see that it is in fact responsive again. I can do the exact same thing to the left navigation. Selecting the left nav, I'll add constraints to the left, top, and bottom, and as I adjust the height, it is in fact responsive. I'll go ahead and do everything that we did, and selecting the preview frame, we'll go ahead and open up the preview window. We can move away from the responsive talk and select the next option, which is touch cursor. This option allows us to have a different styled cursor, which is more of the mobile touch cursor rather than your mouse, and can be useful for when you're showing off a mobile prototype. Our next option is lock selection. You'll use lock selection for when you want to keep the preview focused on a certain layer. When our preview is locked, selecting any other layer on our canvas will not change the preview's focus. To provide you an example, what I've done is I've enabled lock selection and I've shrunk our preview window so that I can have space to work in the background. Moving our canvas to the right, we have another frame called chat override. Selecting chat override is not updating the preview window. If I were to go ahead and disable the lock selection and select chat override, you'll see that the preview window will now update. Moving the canvas to the left, selecting preview is updating our preview window. Our next option is the console. The previous console displays a log of messages from your prototype. We can even add console logs to our override simply by adding console.log and whatever message you want to display. The message I'm going to display for our example is coming from our chat app that we built earlier. I've added a console log to the send message override, and whenever we send a message, you can see that it will be displayed on our console. If we were to go back to the preview window, our next option is present full screen, which just presents our prototype in a full screen. We can hit escape to get out of that. Next, we have show interaction highlights, which gives us this blue indicator for when a user misclicks or is trying to find different elements that can be interacted with. And lastly, we have open a new tab, which just opens our prototype in a new tab. Back in our project, the last thing to cover in the preview window is the top right section where there are several icons. The first icon allows us to preview our prototype on a mobile device. The second one is the lock selection. Third one is the console. Fourth one is a refresh icon, which just refreshes the canvas. And the fifth one is the close icon. That's going to wrap up the preview window. Next, we'll look into sharing our prototypes. In our final tutorial, we're going to go over sharing. Before we actually share our prototype, let's look at handoffs. Handoffs allows us to see element distances as well as CSS or JSX code. As we switch between different layers, in the right panel, we can see the CSS being updated. We can leave handoff mode by clicking handoff at the top right. We're finally ready to share our prototype, so in the top right section, I'll hit the share button. A pop-up will appear telling us to share the prototype. At the very top, there is a URL we can copy and send to clients or individuals who need to view our prototype. And on the bottom, we have different checkboxes. I'll uncheck hide framer interface and check show interaction highlights as well link to selected frame. I'll go ahead and select open prototype. This will open up the prototype in a separate tab. We can interact with the prototype as we wish, and in the top right section, we can hit full screen or copy the link. That's going to wrap things up for sharing. It really is that easy to get your work viewed by others.